Hello, my name is Mike Robinson. I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, and you find me here in the James Crawle Garden attached to the Fairmaids House, our headquarters in Perth. It feels very fitting to be here to talk about climate change when James Crawle, who was born in 1821, played such a strong role in the understanding of climate science, particularly through glacial epochs. So, what is climate change? Well, I think we all have an understanding of that, but the UNFCCC define it as climate change means a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time periods. So that's how they define it, but I think we all understand it as the climate we're experiencing, the change in climate we're experiencing through the impact of human emissions. What I'm going to do is just try and quickly recap the science, talk about the impacts, and try to discuss what we as an organisation and we all as individuals can do about climate change. What we do know is that the science has been around for a long time. This is not new. It began, arguably, there's many scientists who contributed, but Tyndall back in 1859, who defined the greenhouse effect. You have James Crawle, who's this model behind me represents, looking at the eccentric orbit of the Earth around the Sun and the variability and the tilt and wobble of the Earth and how that impacted climate and glacial epochs. You had people, explorers like Nordenskjöld, who explored the Arctic and thought he'd found a new mineral in Greenland, a black powder lying on the ice, which just turned out to be coal deposits and soot from the factories of Europe. Svante Arrhenius, who formulated the greenhouse law. You had Guy Callendar in the 1930s, who first identified for definite that carbon dioxide was affecting climate change, but he actually thought that it could be used to avoid a future glacial epoch if managed carefully. You had Milankovitch, who refined Crawle's theories of climate and time, and we now have Milankovitch cycles or Crawle-Milankovitch cycles. Then in the 1950s, Charles Keeling started studying carbon dioxide levels in Mauna Loa, and we started to have a reliable backdrop to that incessant increase in carbon dioxide. You had other activities going on, more science going on throughout the 70s. Don't forget that we didn't used to be able to define plate tectonics as a certain science until the 1970s because we didn't have ocean sediment cores. And those ocean sediment cores also helped to prove things like Milankovitch cycles. So that wasn't until 1976 that we had the ocean sediment cores to be able to give certainty to this 100-year-old science. But it was only took 1 year later, 1977, that William Nordhaus, an economist at Yale, first defined the principle of a 2 degrees C increase in global average temperature as being a safe limit. It was 1979 that the science took another step forwards, particularly through the Jason report, where a series of American experts came together over the summer to discuss a number of findings, usually related to military activity, and in fact realised that global warming was happening and it was actually a serious threat to global security. So since 1979, we have known the science for pretty much certain. Arguably, up until that point, climate change was the accidental consequence of being unsustainable. But since 1979, it's been an active choice. In essence, what the science has told us is that if you add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, the temperature will go up. So, have we added carbon dioxide to the atmosphere? Well, I think you know the answer to that is yes. Throughout human experience, carbon dioxide levels have fluctuated between roughly 180 parts per million to around about 280 parts per million. But since the Industrial Revolution, that started to climb significantly. When the RSGS was founded back in 1884, atmospheric carbon dioxide was around 292 parts per million, so slightly higher than the previous industrial high, and at that point still the highest in human experience. Within all of climate change science, and there's an awful lot of it, there are two critical numbers that are useful to understand. The first is the threshold at which atmospheric carbon dioxide is thought to become critical or dangerous. and that threshold is 450 parts per million. I said earlier that we're already sitting at around 415 parts per million and releasing between 2 and 3 parts per million every year. So you can work out how long we have until we hit 450. 450 parts per million is important because it's the number that a lot of IPCC work, so a lot of the international scientific community's work, is predicated on avoiding. As soon as we slip over 450 parts per million, there is a fear that we risk moving the world into a more than 2 degrees increase on average. So 450 ppm is a really important critical threshold figure. Just so you're clear, even if we manage to keep the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels equivalent below 450 parts per million, there's still a 1/3 chance that we exceed 2 degrees C. So is a 2 degrees C rise in global average temperature something to worry about? For me, the easiest analogy is to relate it to the human body. Would you worry if your body temperature went up by 2 degrees C? Actually, it's quite a timely question. With COVID, there's a lot of focus on body temperature as a trigger for concern around COVID. Our average body temperature is roughly 37 degrees C, so roughly double what the Earth's is. And if we have a 37.8 degrees C temperature, it's reportable for track and trace. So that's less than a single degree increase in temperature. The world has a 14 to 15 degrees C average and has already increased 1 degree since the Industrial Revolution. It is really critical we don't see another degree's rise because all sorts of feedbacks potentially then start to kick in. The obvious one is albedo. The ice at the poles, as it melts, reflects heat back into space. If we lose ice, more heat is absorbed instead of being reflected, and so the temperature goes up further. And there are many, many different feedback mechanisms that could kick in. So this is a very high risk. How do you do this so there's still an economy, there's still wealth in the community, there's still education, there's still life going on around it? It can't just be a complete and utter lockdown. Or can it? Actually, COVID, which is just one single pandemic and far less profound than climate change, has already caused significant change societally. Maybe we need to be a bit more ambitious in what we're prepared to consider for climate change. And the final reason, I suppose, or there's many reasons, but another reason we haven't really sorted this out, is that money and power tend to rest in the hands of, and in the vested interests of people and industries who already have it. And they don't particularly want to change unless they absolutely have to. So there's a whole range of reasons why we haven't sufficiently tackled this global issue. I was going to use a quick slide here of this cartogram of global carbon dioxide emissions, looking at the impact that different countries have and expanding the country based on its emissions profile. You can see immediately the impact of Europe, the US and China on global emissions. And it's a great resource just to help define who is actually responsible for the emissions in the first place as it currently stands. So how has the global community responded to this known science? It's worth saying that the first World Climate Conference took place in 1979 when the science was really pretty settled. It led to further discussions, more global scientific collaboration, eventually to the establishment of climate conferences. But it took 16 years before the first Conference of the Parties, COP1, which was a coming together of all the world's governments based on the IPCC report, the Scientific Community's International Report from 1990, where governments first actually sat round the table to properly discuss climate change and how they could respond. It took another 3 years before the Kyoto Protocol was signed by a very small number of countries, most of whom failed to deliver on any of the promises. It was COP15, these are annual conferences. COP15 in 2009 in Copenhagen, which everybody looked to for the big change. This was the year that the UK and Scottish Climate Acts kicked in, and Copenhagen was an opportunity where all of the world's governments were actually on the case. There wasn't another major global issue dominating the world stage, and climate change was front and centre. And it still led to almost nothing. Hugely disappointing at the time. and really making us all realise how difficult this job was of tackling climate change at scale. It was 6 years again after that Paris happened, COP21, and the Paris Agreement was signed. And this was really the first time to cheer an international agreement coming out of the COP process. Still painfully slow and difficult to get people to commit to. America only committed to it by Obama not taking it through the Senate, which unfortunately meant that Trump could reverse it as soon as he came into power. But it got 190 countries to sign it and make their own commitments. And the way it worked was that they made their own voluntary contributions, NDCs, as to how they were going to help deliver against climate reductions. Of course, this international process continues next year now, in November, in Glasgow, COP26. And that, again, is becoming a very crucial meeting. 2020 is a year that a lot of previous targets signed through the COP process end. So there isn't anything to replace them at this stage on the international level other than the NDCs agreed in Paris. COP26 in Glasgow is the world's best chance and next chance to properly nail down some new commitments, new targets, and help move this situation forwards. Paris is the best step we have, it's the best agreement we have, but it isn't enough. And this next slide on global greenhouse emissions shows you why. We need to keep global temperature below 2 degrees C. If we don't do anything currently, the trajectory is to head more towards 4 to 5 degrees C, which would be catastrophic. The current NDCs or INDCs that different countries brought to the table, what they were voluntarily prepared to do, but weren't necessarily going to do, they just promised to, amounted to at least 3.5 degrees C rise on where we are at the moment, which is nearly double what we need. So again, there's not enough. The Paris Agreement was good, it was helpful, but it's still not enough. It's a great step forward, but it is only voluntary. And we have a long way to go to get down to 2 degrees C. The other thing that Paris did very clearly was it identified that 1.5 degrees C would be an awful lot better than 2, and it actually suggested we aim lower than 2 degrees C. They felt the risks were too high. There is a very difficult debate around this because many people think we're already too late to avoid 1.5 degrees C, because some of the carbon emissions we've already put into the atmosphere will continue to affect temperature for another 100 years or more. So we might be already too late for 1.5 degrees. But 2 degrees is a threshold we really, really don't want to pass. So I guess the question then is, well, how has Scotland responded to all of this? What's happened here at home? Scotland has undoubtedly shown leadership in climate targets. We had a target set in 2009 after the largest civil society campaign this country's ever known for a 42% reduction in emissions by 2020 and an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. At the time that was set, the 2020 emissions target of 42% was largely viewed as being pretty much impossible. Nobody quite knew how we'd get there. Ironically, we arrived there 6 years early. So the targets in themselves are great, they're a fantastic ambition, but they're not enough, same as the science wasn't enough. And there are two things that we now need to do very urgently. One is we need to share that example, that leadership, that ambition, and try and inspire others to do the same. So we need to internationalise that effort. But the other thing that we absolutely have to do to have any credibility whatsoever is to be ambitious at home and achieve those targets. But 2019 saw another change, and this change was the massive upswelling of concern from young people, epitomised by the school strikes. I actually accidentally attended the first school strike in Edinburgh back in March of last year, where 2 young school pupils sat outside the Scottish Parliament. By May that was several thousand, and by September there were 15,000 kids marching down the Royal Mile, there were 6,000 marching through Glasgow, and another 15 or so demonstrations in Scotland and millions around the world, inspired by the example of Greta Thunberg. It's partly for this reason that we sent 3 young geographers across to Stockholm to hand Greta Thunberg our Geddes Medal and a Fellowship of the Society for her incredible inspiration to global youth.
My message to the Scottish Parliament is, I think, the same as to every Parliament, that they are currently not doing nearly enough, and they need to really step up the game and to realize that what is at stake. This is a question of life and death, and they can't just keep compromising, so that we can do and so on. They need to really get their shit together and start doing things.
Greta's impact on the awareness of climate change has been absolutely incredible and has affected every country in the world. And she's right to be concerned. There is a massive issue of intergenerational justice. We have borrowed from the future. We've borrowed from the future of nature, borrowed from the future of the atmosphere. And we're currently borrowing vast amounts financially as well to mitigate short-term issues. We absolutely owe it to the next generation and the generation after that and the one after that to sort this problem out. And in truth, we're running out of time to do so. We maybe have 10 to 15 years to really nip this in the bud, or we are in serious danger of crossing the thresholds, the 450 parts per million and the 2 degrees C that I talked about earlier. There is a sense that climate change hasn't happened yet, and I think that is now out of date as well. Alice Bowes from the Tyndall Centre used a quote that sums this up perfectly, that it is no longer about preventing climate change. 2 degrees C represents the threshold between dangerous climate change and extremely dangerous climate change. It is now about trying to make sure it doesn't run away with itself and keep the impacts as low as we possibly can. There are 2 obvious responses to climate change. The first is to adapt to it, which is a reaction to impacts that are existing or expected. And the second is to mitigate, which basically just means to cut back and try to prevent the problem in the first place. Adaptation is easier to consider, it's easier to think about and easier to get your head around in many ways. We want to protect ourselves from its impacts. An obvious one is flooding. Often we think about coastal flooding, which can be exacerbated by storm surges and increased energy in the oceans and in the atmosphere. And we're seeing some evidence of that. There's fluvial flooding, which we're used to, and we are beginning to see more and more flood defence measures going in to rivers around the country. And still many homes in Britain are at risk of flooding. Don't move anywhere with water in the street name or the house name is a good general guide. But that is a continuing risk. And of course, in recent storms, we've also seen a great deal of pluvial flooding, recognising that a lot of our infrastructure, particularly our drainage system, is Victorian, and it is not designed to cope with the quantity of water that we're receiving in very short bursts. Just recently, in the most obvious storm this year, the thunderstorms left 1 train derailed and 3 people dead in Stonehaven because of landslides, because of extreme pluvial flooding. And we've actually seen at least £1 million of damage just in Perth alone on the back of those storms. Clearly, there are many things we can do about that. We can increase literally the size of drainage and the size of guttering. We can try slightly more obvious measures, building walls to keep the river out, but ultimately that just pushes the problem downstream. We maybe need to reverse some of the Victorian drainage that we've seen in fields. We need to see tree planting and rewilding in the upper catchments. We need large-scale catchment management schemes. We need to see more coastal change. There's many issues that we can do to adapt. And adapting in lots of ways is the politically easy option. We spend money now on infrastructure, and that's good for jobs, and we get to see something physical on the back of it, like a wall along the side of a river. But in some ways it's too easy a political option, and it doesn't solve the problem. If we're going to sort out climate change and have a future that we can all hope about and dream about and look optimistically towards, we've actually got to tackle the problem, which means we've got to mitigate. And that means we've got to cut back emissions. It's much harder to do. It's much less politically popular because politicians are telling you not to do things that you want to do or think they are. And it's not as tangible. You're not investing in something you're building. You're stopping something from happening that's just not helpful. But in developed nations, the priority absolutely should be on mitigation. In fact, in a very recent Oxfam report, it points out that the richest 1% of the global population are causing twice as much as the poorest 10%. And definitely, the amount of carbon dioxide, amount of greenhouse gases we emit is very closely related to how wealthy we are as a nation and as individuals. In any response, there is a sort of hierarchy when you're trying to cut back. The very best thing you can do is to cut out altogether and just realize that you don't need the thing that you thought you did. There are many different ways to consider that, but cutting out is definitely the first line of attack. The second is to just cut back, to use less, to be more thrifty, to be more resourceful, to be more careful and cautious. A good example, actually, with nitrogen use in agriculture, farmers are actually seeing losses of maybe 96% in some cases. So 96% of nitrogen that's applied is being lost before it actually ends up in doing the job it's there for, because it's distributed, it's used in too many quantities, it's washed into water systems, it's just lost in the whole process of distribution and application. And that clearly is just wasteful. So in essence, cutting back really just means stopping being wasteful, finding ways to be more and more and more efficient. It requires a bit of ingenuity. We then need to look at options, other alternatives that we could use that are lower carbon. Great example here is cement. Portland cement is the most traded commodity in the world after water. It causes 8% of global emissions, and there are alternatives, but we don't use them. So could we replace Portland cement, which is very heat-intensive process to create, with a cement like geopolymer, which is chemically bonded and is 95% more carbon efficient? We could carry on building, but cut 7-8% of global emissions. So we need to start taking those options seriously. So carbon capture and storage and areas of capture of emissions is one of the last priorities. It's the last thing you should do, not the first. Or it's nearly the last thing you should do. The very last thing you should do, because it's the least credible response to climate change, is to try to offset your emissions. And what you're basically saying there is we're going to carry on emitting these emissions, we're going to carry on pumping carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but we'll try to do something that over here that sucks them up. And the obvious example of offsetting is tree planting. But you do need to tree plant at scale, you need to leave it for 50 to 100 years minimum, and you need to actually, to make a serious impression on, say, a gigaton of carbon globally, you'd actually need to plant an area roughly the size of India. And that's the scale we're talking about. So offsetting is the last resort. And I've coined this acronym CO3 to try to help just act as a prompt for that. Cut out first, then cut back, then look for options. And only if you can't do those do you capture emissions or finally offset them. Too often we're problem solving this issue in reverse. We start with offsetting and work our way forwards. And industries waiting for carbon and capture to be the answer are wasting an awful lot of time when they could be making a difference by cutting out, cutting back and finding and developing and innovating alternatives and options. 2020 should have been a big year for climate change. In 2019, the profile of climate change because of the school strikes was the highest it's ever been, and the willingness of all sorts of industries and organisations to come around the table and talk about how to help has never been so high. That, of course, has dissipated slightly with the current pandemic, and that has certainly put climate change on the back burner a wee bit. The COP, the Conference of the Parties, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which was to come to Glasgow in November 2020, is now coming to Glasgow in November 2021, as long as it can still go ahead, and hopefully we're beyond the pandemic at that point. It is a huge opportunity for the UK and for Scotland. It is not just an opportunity to influence the international negotiation, it's an opportunity for us to show our global leadership around this issue and to make the most of that, to promote that to the rest of the world, hopefully to inspire much, much wider action generally. But there will be a lot of focus on climate change over the next few months. The biggest single project we've been working on over the last 3 to 4 years is to address a knowledge gap. We have recognised that actually very few people genuinely understand this issue, understand which bits of the science are critical, what the policy momentum is behind it, and actually, most crucially, what they can do about it. What are the solutions? What are the main answers to this huge dilemma? So we hope that our climate solutions qualification would be a very, very positive contribution to this whole discussion. We already have a commitment for more than 100 civil servants to come on the course as part of the programme for government. We are talking to the Parliament about every MSP sitting the course in some form. The course for managers is already available. We hope to have the student course available by the early part of 2021. So if there's nothing else you can do for climate change, help allow change to happen, or even nurture it. And that, I think, is where the optimism in this subject lies.
I cannot say that I'm very proud of what my generation has done and what we are going to leave them. But we still have time to do something, and we cannot afford to fail.
Welcome to the Climate Solutions Qualification. This programme contains 4 modules and 1 workshop and will build your knowledge and skills on how to respond to the most profound challenge faced by managers, climate change.
We have knowledge about approximately what is going to happen if we don't act. And there are tipping points. The future living conditions for all species are at risk.
During the one-day workshop, you will develop your own climate solutions plan. Throughout the modules, there is an online learning journal for you to complete and refer back to when developing your plan.
Every business is going to have to ask themselves, and should be asking themselves, how will climate change affect my business today, tomorrow, in the decades ahead? And what am I doing about it? What am I doing to adjust?
The context in which organisations operate is about to change, and it's only those that are climate change ready that will be able to survive and prosper.
You have to be responsible long term. Your actions or your inactions are going to determine the future of the children of your country and the children of other countries.
Really, it's down to business leaders, decision makers, to implement the changes that will make a real difference.
Future employment will depend on being able to think, talk and act in a climate positive way.